Welcome to the fifth mini lecture on Germany. And when I left you last time, I talked about how after Bismarck left his job, future German leaders kind of ignored his prudence. Germany underwent a naval arms race with the British. At the last minute, they tried to engage in a mad overseas scramble for colonies. Like you mentioned, Namibia, for example, German Southwest Africa as an example. The Germans' provocative actions brought the French and the British together, who, remember, had been enemies for a long period of time. Bismarck had warned about not getting too cozy with Austria, especially in their rivalry with the Russians. And of course, future leaders ignored that. And the result was that we end up with World War I. World War I was a disaster. And at the end of the war, remember, the Germans were blamed for the war. They had been given crushing reparations. They had lost all their overseas colonies. They had also lost the Alsace-Lorraine, and they had lost some territory to Poland. At the end of the war, we get what appears to be a glimmer of hope in Germany. The Weimar Republic was created. This was Germany's first failed democracy. It was a democracy that only lasted for 14 years before it was destroyed. And as your notes point out, on paper, this democratic regime looked very good. It was a democracy, though, that unfortunately, like the Third and Fourth Republics in France, stress equity and equality and democracy and not order and stability. But if you take a look at the regime, it looked very, very progressive. Both men and women over age 21 were given the right to vote. All Germans were guaranteed the right to a job. And if a job was not available, they were entitled to full unemployment compensation. This is something that came much later, for example, to the United States. The Germans were also guaranteed national health insurance, which went back, remember, to the Bismarckian period in the 1880s. The system was a mixed presidential parliamentary system that looked a lot like the current French political system. The president was directly elected by the people. There was some real decision-making powers, including an emergency clause provision that suspended civil liberties and rights, and certainly Adolf Hitler abuses this emergency clause provision in consolidating power in his country. As your notes point out, the Weimar Republic, in my mind, was mortally wounded for three reasons, and they are mentioned by Ruskin. I'll just elaborate very little on this because I think he did a good job here. I'm always picking on poor Ruskin when I think he leaves something out, so I should give him credit for when I think he does something well, and I think he does list all three of these, although probably a little more detail would have been warranted. As I've pointed out in earlier lectures, and as he mentions, the Germans did not have any experience with democracy. There was not a democratic political culture. And as a result, probably only about 1 out of 4 people in Germany during the Weimar period were really committed to democracy. And as I put it, were wholehearted Democrats. 1 out of 4 hated democracy. And where I would expand on this is think about this. During the Weimar period, we've lost colonies, we've lost prestige. This is a regime that has been imposed basically externally under the pressure of military defeat. And if you're a German after World War I, what are the good old days? Well, the good old days were during the Bismarckian period. The good old days were under authoritarianism, where we had a high standard of living. Bismarck at one time had Germany in the center. In fact, the Congress of Berlin which carved up the European continent, was in 1881. It was in Germany. It was in Berlin. Bismarck was the host. So for a lot of Germans, when they looked back on the old days, it wasn't seen as, oh, it's wonderful. Now we have a democracy. We finally, after all these years, have thrown off the yoke of authoritarianism. For many Germans, authoritarianism wasn't bad. High standard of living, prestige, etc. So the first mortal wound for the Weimar Republic was you didn't have a citizenry very excited about it. The second was that the system lacked legitimacy. We've talked about legitimacy many times in this course. And essentially, this political system was forced on them by the victors. It wasn't something that the Germans had come up with themselves. And Roskin points out in his mind the most important reason why the Weimar Republic failed was that the punitive terms humiliated and economically hobbled the new country. And I would add, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that the emphasis in the creation of the Weimar Republic was democracy and equality and not order stability. So if you take a look at this political system under the Weimar Republic, in the 14 years of the Weimar Republic, there were 22 governments. In other words, the Weimar Republic had the same problems as the Third and Fourth Republics. There were unstable governing coalitions that were the result of splintered party systems, and it meant that there was no coherent long-range planning because no one was in authority long enough to set the country on any particular direction. Something that Roskin leaves out that I would also add, and I didn't have this in the notes, but was the effect of the World Depression. The World Depression was devastating. And the World Depression, and if you look in your notes, you'll see 4 stars there. Certainly, this is something I will put into the test bank for the final. If you look at the diagram on page 139 of your textbook, Giovanni Sartori uses this term polarized pluralism. I mentioned in both Britain and France that in a democratic society, what you want is a unimodal distribution, a so-called bell-shaped curve where a majority of the voters are either moderate or slightly liberal, slightly conservative. So in the case of Britain and France, when we looked at that political continuum, and you will see that in Germany as well, the vast majority of voters in Britain, France, and Germany are slightly left, slightly right, or in the middle. That was also true in the Weimar Republic for quite some time until the Depression hit. And when the Depression hit, there was this center fleeing tendency in which people who tended to be a little bit left went way left, went for the socialists and increasingly for the communists. People who were slightly right became nationalists, and then extra nationalists became Nazis. So if you take a look at 1932, 37% of the electorate voted for the Nazi Party, 17% voted for the communists, and about 20% voted socialist. Now, what's intriguing to me is that if the socialists and the communists had formed an alliance, and I talked earlier about how in the French system, the communists and the socialists formed this informal alliance, they might have been able to have derailed Hitler. But what's intriguing is that both the socialist and communist leaders saw Adolf Hitler as kind of a clown-like figure, as not really a serious threat. The socialists and the communists saw each other as the primary rival for power in the country. And so they focused their attention, their ire on one another, and essentially Hitler snuck by both of them. And of course, the result was that early in 1933, Adolf Hitler became the new chancellor of the country. And so in your notes, I have the Third Reich. So notice you had the First Reich as the Holy Roman Empire. The Second Reich after the unification of Germany, and now the Third Reich. And notice this one doesn't last very long, only 12 years. The title that I have in your note, Hitler, A Study in Tyranny, comes from what I personally believe is the best book I've ever written on Adolf Hitler. If any of you are interested in Hitler, look up a book by Alan Bullock. He was a British historian who wrote a book by this title, Hitler, A Study in Tyranny. I know I've got one copy of the book. I actually think I have two copies of this book. An excellent case study. So I'll go through this quickly. I have 4 minutes left in this mini lecture, and you can follow this for yourself. But obviously, Germany became a highly centralized unitary state under Hitler and the Nazis. Hitler was a war lover, and unfortunately, his foreign policy eventually resulted in World War II in Europe after Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. What's intriguing is that Hitler signed a very surprising non-aggression pact with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, which basically meant that Hitler and the Nazis would not have to fight a two-front war, that with the Soviet Union out of the way, the Germans could concentrate on fighting the French and the British and the Poles and some of the other minor powers in Europe. And of course, Hitler did very well early on in the war. In this case, taking over essentially all of continental Europe before turning eventually on his ally. You should know that Hitler also engaged in genocide, the murder of an entire group of people. There is a question I'll put in the test bank: who was the primary group that Hitler and the Nazis targeted for genocide? And of course, that's the Jews. It's estimated that about 6 million Jews were killed in what the Nazis called the final solution. And my mentor and his mother were very lucky. Most of their family died in the death camps, and he and his mother were able to escape, and they ended up in New York City. And thank goodness for that, because he had a tremendous influence on me. Number 4, under the Third Reich, even though Hitler signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union in 1939, which freed him up to take over most of continental Europe, Hitler, of course, ends up double-crossing his ally. This is one of the few years questions that I will ask on the exam. You should know that the invasion of the Soviet Union occurred in June of 1941, June 22nd to be precise. The Soviets to this day call World War II the Great Patriotic War. Roskin points out that the invasion of the Soviet Union was probably the end of the war for Germany, because it is in Russia, just as it was for Napoleon. The Russian winner destroyed Napoleon and his army, and the same was true. The Russian winter was devastating for the Germans, and in this particular case, the Germans were defeated. There are some stars there. You should know that it was at Yalta that the Allies decided that they were going to divide Germany again into zones of occupation. So the war ends and Germany returns to its fragmented state. At the end of the war, we have an East Germany that is dominated by the Soviet Union, and a West Germany that's dominated by the United States, Britain, and France. Germany becomes ground zero in the first stage of the Cold War. You should know that the United States unveiled the Marshall Plan, a Marshall financial aid package for European economic recovery. And so we have almost another half a century of division from 1945 until 1990. We have the division of the country, and then in 1990 we get the reunification of Germany. And in the next lecture, I'll talk about institutions.